Hey there, it's raining outside again. The perfect night for another dark story before you drift to sleep. Remember to leave a light on, just in case, when you're ready. Take a deep breath. Relax. And let me tell you something that might keep you awake a little longer. It was a cold, wet evening in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Sheriff Schlee's car cut through the fog, its siren lights glowing faintly in the storm. He wasn't sure what he would find inside the Gein property, but the silence that lingered in the air felt wrong. The house stood like a skeleton, its walls gray, its windows dark, and the porch collapsing under the weight of decay. Locals whispered that Ed Gein was strange, quiet, polite, but not right in the head. When Bernice Warden went missing from her hardware store that morning, everyone hoped it was just a robbery. No one expected what was waiting inside that farmhouse. The door creaked open. The smell hit them first, a foul, sweet rot that clung to the air. The beam of the flashlight caught something hanging from the rafters. And then, silence. Even the rain seemed to stop. In that moment, the legend of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, was born. And what they found inside would redefine the meaning of horror forever. It was a cold, wet evening in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air in Plainfield felt heavier, like the earth itself knew what had been uncovered. Reporters gathered at the edge of the Gein property, their shoes sinking into the wet soil. Some whispered, some smoked in silence. None were ready for what the sheriff's men found inside. The farmhouse was a tomb, not just for bodies, but for memories. Every object inside seemed soaked in madness. Old newspapers glued to the walls, jars filled with something no one wanted to name, and silence that pressed against your chest like weight. They found skulls used as bowls, human skin turned into furniture, a belt made from what could only be called remnants of people, and in the shed, Bernice Warden hanging upside down, drained, cut open like an animal. No one spoke for a long time. It wasn't murder, it was desecration. And in the center of it all stood Ed Gein's small, tidy bed, as if he still believed he lived an ordinary life. Neighbors said he was kind. He'd fix your fence, shovel your snow. But behind that smile, he was listening to voices no one else could hear. His mother's voice, commanding, controlling. She'd been gone for years, but to Ed, she never left. As the sun struggled through the fog, one officer muttered, "He lived here, with this." Another replied softly, "No, he lived for this." And just like that, Plainfield changed forever. The news spread through Wisconsin like wildfire. By nightfall, every radio station echoed the same name, Ed Gein. To the world, he was a monster. But inside the interrogation room, he looked more like a frightened old child than a killer. Sheriff Schlee watched him carefully. Ed sat hunched, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes distant, as if he wasn't really there. When asked about Bernice Warden, he didn't deny it. He simply nodded and whispered, "She's out at the farm." But that was only the beginning. What came next chilled the officers to their bones. Ed spoke of late-night graveyard visits, of digging up women who reminded him of his mother. He described their faces, their skin, their shapes, with a calmness that made every word feel heavier. He wasn't lying. He wasn't even proud. He sounded almost relieved. When they asked why, he gave the same answer every time. I wanted her back. I just wanted my mother back. The room went silent. The rain outside tapped against the window like nervous fingers, and for a moment, no one could breathe. One detective leaned forward and whispered, "Ed, do you know what you've done?" Ed turned his head slowly, his expression blank. "She told me to. She talks to me. In the house." No one said another word after that, because in that moment, they realized they weren't speaking to a man anymore. They were listening to the echo of his mother, speaking through him. They called it the Gein house, but it was never really a home. It was a shrine built from grief, stitched together with madness. When investigators returned in daylight, the fog had lifted, but the horror inside hadn't faded. Every room was worse than the last. The kitchen sink was filled with stains that no scrubbing could erase. Pots hung above the counter, and on the stove, something boiled that no one dared to look at too closely. In the living room, they found chairs upholstered in human skin, masks made from faces, and skulls turned into bowls. One of the deputies stepped outside and vomited in the snow. Another refused to ever go back in. But what unsettled them most wasn't the gore. It was the order. Everything was clean, arranged, almost careful, as if Ed believed he was preserving something sacred. Then they opened a locked door. His mother's room, untouched, perfect, covered in dust, yet preserved like a church altar. The rest of the house was rot and chaos, but her room was peace. He hadn't let anyone in, not even himself. That's when they understood. He didn't build a house of death. He built a temple, and she was his god. Outside, the wind howled across the barren fields. Inside, the officers stood among bones and silence, realizing the most terrifying truth of all. Ed Gein didn't kill out of hate. He killed out of love. Love so twisted, it turned devotion into desecration. They said Ed Gein was insane. But insanity is too simple a word for what lived inside his mind. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He sat calmly in the hospital chair, hands folded, eyes staring into nothing, like he was listening to a voice no one else could hear. Doctors asked him about the bodies, about the faces, about the nights spent digging through frozen soil. He answered softly, almost politely. "I didn't do it for fun," he said. "I wanted her back. I wanted to make her proud again." Each question peeled away another layer of his delusion. He spoke of rituals, not evil, but necessary, of the way he'd sit in the dark, wearing a woman's skin, speaking to her reflection in the mirror, as if she could finally see him again. He wasn't trying to become his mother. He was trying to feel close to her, to erase the distance death had built. Psychiatrists called it psychosis. Others called it obsession. But to Ed, it was love, the only kind he'd ever known. He saw death not as an end, but as transformation. Flesh was just a vessel, and the spirit lived on. And if the vessel could be remade, maybe love could too. Behind that calm, empty stare was a man who believed he was healing something, fixing what life had broken. But you can't rebuild love out of bones. You can only bury it, again and again, until there's nothing left of you but the echo of her voice. The trial of Ed Gein wasn't about guilt. Everyone already knew what he'd done. It was about whether he was sane enough to understand it. In the small courthouse of Wisconsin, reporters filled every seat. Some came for justice, others for spectacle. When Ed entered the room, wearing the same blank expression he'd worn since his arrest, the air grew still. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man lost in a memory he couldn't wake from. The prosecutor spoke of horror, of skin lamps, masks, and graves. The crowd shifted uneasily, but Ed sat quietly, blinking now and then, as if none of it belonged to him. When asked if he regretted anything, he tilted his head slightly and said, "I didn't mean harm. I just missed her." Gasps filled the room. That was his truth, simple, terrifying, and completely detached from reality. The judge declared him legally insane. Ed was sent to Central State Hospital, where the walls were white, the lights humming softly, and the world finally forgot his name. There, he lived quietly for decades, gardening, reading, humming to himself. Nurses said he was polite, gentle. Sometimes he'd stare out the window for hours, waiting for something no one else could see. When he died in 1984, there was no ceremony, just a small grave in Plainfield marked with his name. But people came anyway, not to mourn, but to look, because monsters die. But legends, they never really do. Years passed, but Plainfield never forgot. The farmhouse was torn down, the land left barren, and the townspeople tried to pretend nothing had ever happened there. But evil leaves an echo, a stain that no fire or time can erase. What Ed Gein did inside that house didn't just shock a town, it rewired the world's understanding of horror. From the twisted basement of Psycho's Norman Bates, to Leatherface's mask in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to the cold elegance of Hannibal Lecter, they all began with him, one quiet man, haunted by his mother's voice. But beneath the gore, the story of Ed Gein isn't about blood, it's about loneliness. A man so isolated, so broken by devotion, that he mistook death for love, and madness for purpose. In his world, grief was not something to survive. It was something to worship. Today, his name lives on, whispered in documentaries, dramatized in films, dissected in podcasts. But the truth remains the same. Ed Gein wasn't a monster from hell. He was a man who created one inside himself. And maybe that's why his story still unsettles us. Because it blurs the line between us and him, between sanity and surrender, between love and obsession. When the wind passes over the empty field where his house once stood, it carries a strange stillness, as if the earth itself remembers what he did there. And somewhere, beneath the soil and silence of Plainfield, the echo of his mother's voice still whispers, "Eddie, are you there?"